Okay, we're going to take a little detour from the pythonanvil.com tutorial to talk a little bit more about how to work with databases and how to call database operations on the server. To do this, we're going to start with the previous example that we had called CRUD test. We're going to open that up and make a clone. So go to publish, click clone app, and you'll see you get a link here. This link gives you a copy of all the front end code, all the back end code, and the database with all of its data intact. So all the rows of the database will be intact in the clone. Click on that, and this will allow us to make a copy in our account. Cloning is used by the community to share source code. You can post these links on the forum. You can send them in an email. You can send them in a chat. And a great way to get all of the code and all of the data in an app over to anybody else you want to have your source code. So now we have a clone of the CRUD test app. By default, it's named clone of the original app. And what we're going to do here is move the database operations into some server code. So as it exists, this app enables front-end forms to search, edit, and delete database tables. And I mentioned a few times that that's not secure. The reason that it's not secure is that front-end code, anything in the client code area of Anvil, is downloaded and run in a browser. And in the browser, users can look at that source code and make changes to that code. And if they know what they're doing, and if database operations are included in that front-end code, they can potentially make changes to your database that you don't want to enable. So what we're going to do is click here, revert that to its initial default state, which is no access. So by default, forms in Anvil are not permitted access to database tables. Only server module code is allowed to run database operations. Okay, so now with that change made, if we run this application, all of this code that we have that runs on the form, like the search and the add row methods, will break. They will not work properly, and you can see here when we run the app, we get called from form 1 line 12, a data table permissions error. Okay, so what we're going to do to make that code now a bit more secure is we're going to add a server module. So the difference between the server modules and the client modules is that client code runs in the user's browser, and server code runs on the Anvil server machine, as does the database system. So this server code is not accessible to users. They can't make any changes to the code on the server side because they don't have it accessible on their machine. Any code that's up here in the Form 1 or any other client code is accessible to users, and they can make changes. So the way this server module works is, we'll clean this up a little bit. You'll see the first thing in this example that they give you is the decoration anvil.server.callable. That decoration makes any function that you write in an Anvil server accessible from Form 1 code or from the client code. So let's create ourselves a new function here, and we'll just say this is search DB, and we'll take out any parameters here. Try and type this properly. Search DB. Okay, so now we got a function called search DB. I'm going to get this function typed in properly. Yep. And we'll take out the definition here. And what we're going to do with this definition is place in the search code that we originally had in the front end. So when this application first starts in our init method, we set the items property of the repeating panel to be the results of a data table search. So I'm going to take that code out of the front end, go back to our server module, and place that code into this new function we've got running on the server. And what we're going to do with that is simply return it. So when this function is called, the server will run this search and return it to the calling method or the calling function. So over here, when the app begins, self-repeating panel items will be set to the data that's returned from that function. The way we access that function is by typing in anvil.server.call. You can see Anvil is helping us auto-complete each of those little bits. And when we invoke the call method, it shows us all of the functions that can be called on the server. So in this case, we've called this function, or this function searchDB. And now when we run our app, that call is now called on the server, and we no longer get an error. The repeating panel is populated by the results of that server function. So no longer can a user mess with the code in their browser and potentially make changes to our database because there no longer is access to that database from the front end. And although we can call functions on the server, we have a lot more control about what happens in the code of those functions and what is returned. And all that the user can do is choose to send different parameters to that function. Okay, so the next thing we need to do here is we've got a call to add a row to that database. We're going to take that out of the front end, go back to our server code, and we'll create a new function. So again, we want to use anvil.server.callable, decorate this next function, and we'll call this function add row. And what this function definition will do is exactly what was copied from the front end. So we're just going to add a row. We don't need to pass this add row function any arguments because this is just going to add one empty row. That's what this add row method does. So now let's go back, run. Let's see, make sure we have this called from the front end. We have a function that does the add row operation on the server, but we need to make sure that we actually run that function from the front end. So again, anvil.server.call, and then here you can see it auto-completes. All this is done very easily with auto-completion. Now we want to call the add row function. So let's run this. Now if we click on the new button, blammo, we've got a new row. So now we've done the create and read operations in the CRUD application. But you can see we're going to get some errors when we click on delete, because again, we have data permissions set so that the form can't access. And also the write back operations are not going to work. These bindings are not accessible from the front end. So let's go back to our app here. Okay, so stop this application from running. And in our design, the delete operation is called within the repeating panel template. So again, remember the way that repeating panels work is we wire up each row of display, each panel, to display one row of database results or one row in a list or one row in a dictionary. And each of those rows runs, each of these widgets runs code for that particular row of the database. So when we click on the delete button, we're deleting the row that's displayed in that particular panel that's displaying that particular row of data. And if you remember, we refer to that row returned from the database as self.item. So here the self.item.delete operation, that method, will not work here because we don't have access to the server. We don't have access to the database anymore in the client. So what we're going to do, go over to the server and let's create a new function. We'll decorate it with the anvil.server.callable. decoration. Let's call this delete row and make this a function. Give it a colon. Give it a colon in the right place. Let's close down here our console. Okay, so now we're going to run the delete operation. Now, the problem here is in this context, self.item was something that made sense on form one. Self referred to the form one, and this self.item referred to the row of the database that exists in the form. That reference to the row of the database refers to the form. But that self.item doesn't have the same context here. So we need to change that. What we're going to do is pass the row to the server function, and then we'll do row.delete in the server. So we have a reference to this row. We need to pass that then to the calling function, the calling method. So anvil.server, correctly, anvil.server.call, and we want to call, in this case, the delete function that we just created. Now we have to pass a parameter, and the way we do that, I'm going to put this on a separate line so it's a little more easily readable. If we want to call a function from the front end and pass a parameter to it, you separate the parameters by commas. And in this case, we want to pass the reference to that row, which is referred to in repeating panels by self.item. Okay, so now we run this. We are going to run, when we click this button to delete, we're going to call the delete row function and pass the reference to that row. Click run. Now let's click on delete. And there we go. We got a working delete operation. So the only thing left now to complete this app and move all of the database operations to the server is the update functionality. Now, if you remember, in Anvil, one of the fantastic things about repeating panels is that we can set data bindings so that they have a write back option. So without writing any code, the user can edit contents here and values here, and those values in the database are automatically adjusted and saved. But because we no longer have access to write to the server, we're going to need to do that a different way. So what we're going to do is uncheck these write back options, and what we'll do instead is we'll add another button to this layout, and again, let's size it just a bit so that it's not quite as big. And we'll just use an icon instead of having text there. Let's see what we get here. See if there's a floppy disk. There we go. Use a floppy disk. Okay, now what we want to do is, this is contained in the row of the data panel, or of the repeating panel. And we're going to need to update the that row's data values on the server. So we're going to do anvil.server call, and we currently don't have a function to do that. So let's go here and we'll think about what we want to update in this design. So we have a text box, we have date, we have another text box that has a number, we have another text area that has some larger text. So let's go up and look at our database. In data table 1, we have a name, birthday, number of kids the person has, and some notes about the person. So name, birthday, kids, and notes. So we want to update those columns in the database in the server function. So let's call this update row. We'll decorate it with the anvil.server.callable. We'll define this function as update row. And then we'll take the row that has been passed, use the name row to refer to that as the argument to this function, and we'll do row dot update, and we will set the values that we want to adjust in this function. Okay, so that row, just like we saw previously, we can refer to as self.item. So the first parameter that we're going to send here to this function, get the name of this function with autocomplete. So let's do a bit of autocomplete to get this. We now have update row, and we're going to be passing self.item to refer to the row that in the database that we want to adjust. So self.item. And then we also need to pass each of the values that we want to be sent and changed in that row. So we have text box 1. Let's see what all these values are called. Text box 1, date picker 1, text box 2, and text area 1. So we're sending the values from all of those widgets back to the server. Go back to our code here. And self.item was the first. Self dot text area or text box 1, and then self dot date picker 1, and we want the date value from that. And for this text box, we want the text property sent. And then here we want self dot text box 2, and then the text property for that one. And finally, we want self dot text area 1 and the text property of that. So now we have 5 parameters sent to the server call, the update row server call. So we've got the reference to the row, which we'll call row. And let's see what we had here again. This was called in our database code, this was called our database design, table 1, name, birthday, kids, and notes. So those were the values that we're updating. Let's use that as our name, birthday, kids, and notes. So again, and so now we can say row dot, oh no, just actually birthday, even name. I see what we got here is a little bit issue. For this again, app. A little bit of a problem with the autocomplete. Let's try this again. Okay, so app. Oh, also, we've got a from here. So you'll notice the Anvil autocomplete lets you know when you got some um, syntax errors. It will not autocomplete correctly, and that makes you go properly through your coding um, operations a little more correctly. Let's try now again. There we go. Row dot update. And here we go. It gives us the names of all of the table columns. So first was name, and we'll set that to the variable name that was entered. Let's put each of these on a different line. Okay, and with a comma in between each of these parameters. Birthday. Equals birthday. What do we have here? We have kids. We'll set that row to kids, the kids variable, the parameter that was sent in the argument definition, and then notes equals notes. Okay, so now we've got an Anvil server function that updates the row, taking the row parameter, which was the item, self.item from the front end, and the name, birthday, kids, and notes parameters that were passed. Let's check our item template. We are now calling update row and sending each of those values. So let's go ahead and see if we can update one of these rows. I'll change this to Bill. And we click on the save button and it makes the adjustment. Let's go back into the app database. Database and see if that table has been updated. And there we go. So now we've got all of the CRUD functionality moved to the server. Let's run this one more time. Check everything. We can add a new row. Let's see why that is not showing. Stop the application, run this again. We should have some new rows existing. Okay, so we've got a little bit of an issue right here. Let's check and see why that new row function is not being added. On form 1, when we click on the new button, it's going to run this method, button 1 click, Anvil server call. It runs the add row function on the server, and then we open form 1. So let's run this and see if we're getting any errors. New. Looks like everything is running properly there. Let's go ahead and make a change here. Bill. Click save. The update is running properly. And let's check to make sure that this form 1 button is actually wired up so that the click event runs button 1 click. And it does. So let's run the, let's check for the add row function. Looks like we need to add parentheses around the end. There we go. That's where the problem was. Run again. And now when we click new, ta-da, we've got a new row. Let's make some changes to this. Close person Aaron. Select the date. So that was the 10th of January on the 2023. Say he has one child. Aaron has a dog. Write this correctly. Okay, click save. And let's go back here to the database, make sure that was added correctly. Aaron, 10th of January, one child, Aaron has a dog. So all the update is working properly. We can create, read, update, and let's run the delete operation. And there we go. Let's add one little feature to that delete. Go back to our Form 1 code, and for that delete operation, let's add a little confirmation. So if confirm, and let's see, we'll just ask the user if they actually want to delete that row. And if they do, if we get a true response from the user, then we'll run this code. That way we can't accidentally delete something just by clicking on that button unintentionally. So let's try this. Delete. If I click no, it's not deleted. And if I click yes, it is deleted. Okay, great. We have a fully working CRUD database example with all of the database functionality moved from the form, the front-end client code, to the server code. So that is the process in excruciating detail, which shows you exactly what you need to do to move database operations out of the insecure front end and onto the server module. So we'll do that over and over and over again uh, in this series, and you'll see that it really is just a few minutes of work. Once you get used to the routine, you'll be able to move functions from the front end. So very often we'll use front end code to interact with the database when we're working on an app that maybe is an in-house personal app where we're just not worried about users getting access to the database, where security isn't important, or if it's a little personal app which really doesn't need to be secured, or if we're, for example, creating an app that isn't accessible at all by users in any other way, so that no one ever sees that front end code. So sometimes we're creating admin panels that can't be accessed by any users. Maybe they're password protected. Maybe they're just simply not available to anybody else. They're not, the link for that app is not ever made available to other users. Also for doing prototyping, it's very easy to just make databases accessible on the front end. And it's a super productive way with the built-in write back functionality. You don't have to write any code like we just had to do to update the database. But for apps that are in production, that are public facing, where users have access to the database, we do not want any database code in the front end. And so this is the routine we'll go through to move that code to the server and make it more secure.